whilst slides are being found and given the press and time, I'll just introduce myself. So I'm Nick.
Okay.
I come from a background of population genetics. So I'm not really clinical obesity or BMI person. I'm not really a straight epidemiologist in that sense, but I've had to turn to big cohorts in epidemiology to do my work over the years. And latterly, that's led me to dealing with population-based studies, and indeed with a major focus on first the genetics of overweight and body composition, and then trying to exploit that and how it deals with health. So I've had a focus on adiposity, BMI, and obesity over the years, and I've got a rough feel for the obesity research landscape. Thanks very much.
Just try it there.
Very good, thank you. So yeah, thanks very much for the invitation and for convening this. It's important, isn't it? And great to hear from you, Ken. You always, when I hear you speak, you raise that awareness, which is contextual to everything we do, and it's absolutely required. I'll turn to it later. I've got a challenge here. I've been given now probably 8 minutes to summarize the entire research landscape of obesity. So my mind naturally went to what I look at every now and again, which is this is the classic picture of the metabolic pathways in human. It's basically a scrambled, messy map. Could we condense that? Well, what do? I turn to ChatGPT, obviously, and put in what is the research landscape for obesity. It's not half bad, actually. It draws upon, and this is just from interconnections from published data, published literature, and it spreads a landscape which touches across both basic science and applied science, social science, and other. I guess the take home is that this is a complex landscape, right? And it may well be the feeling that if you just arrived at obesity research like today, you just need to know about incretins and you're done. Right, but it's just not the case. There are layers upon layers upon layers of different domains in this research field. I've simplified this even further into these large chunks of sort of modality. I've thought about observational science and intervention science, a whole bunch of other things in grey on the other side, which aren't my area of expertise, but are critically important. And that relates from social sciences all the way through to the clinical or rather the application and understanding of efficacy and auditing and in clinical circumstance, service provision. All of these, of course, in the context of time and how things are changing radically, literally. I remember writing a grant in only 2016 saying we cannot manage obesity at all. We'll have to reverse engineer it and work out the biology instead. You know, come to now, actually weight change is becoming academic and we're interested in the biology and the outcomes rather than the change itself. I'm just going to focus on 3 of these in the interest of time. Observational studies, very briefly, intervention studies, and then the intersection of some of those areas. From an observational point of view, what I mean by that is not doing something to people or watching or doing experiments, but observing large-scale populations and seeing from an epidemiological point of view what we expect or what relationships are there. The message is clear, and Naveed pointed this out very nicely, which is that the impact, the association profile of overweight and obesity is very broad, touching almost all areas of complex disease that we know about. You think of the work of Bhaskaran and cancer, think of other things. I mean, the large-scale population-based studies that have been done, very global, are suggesting that they're highly likely to be substantive causal correlations between overweight and a vast array of different outcomes. Massive economic implications of that if it's all real. And Naveed mentioned this really nice piece of work that I would advise reading. It's only a short paper that he and others brought together. The implication here is if we're treating single things and extending life, what we're doing is exposing individuals to longer periods with overweight, and we're generating multimorbidity, which is a major, major headache. There are other interesting complexities that come out of observational associations. We think about causality as epidemiologists all the time. You can try and find that in different ways, but one of the problems when we try and assert causality is we think we know what we're measuring and we don't. BMI or overweight and the way that we measure it is a classic example of this. We use clunky tools to try and measure these things, but actually, even though the numbers can be the same, the underlying biology of those things in any given individual can be radically different. So they're inconsistent and it doesn't help. We've seen this over many years in epidemiology. There's this classic image from the Lancet taken probably, I can't remember, 20 years ago now, which is people with exactly the same BMI. When you look at the distribution of adiposity across them, it's radically different. And indeed, there are now rows about how to define obesity, and they are gaining some clarity. We've had a recent commission which suggests that we should be thinking about it in concert with clinical outcomes, but the debate bubbles on, and I'm sure that point will be raised over and over again today. Another avenue from the observational context, which is something I'm very excited about, is the genetics of these complex traits, whether it's regional adiposity, whether it's the outcome obesity or so on, and we can split those things. This slide actually is split in half. On the left-hand side, the cartoons here speak to a world of common genetic variations that we all carry at reasonable frequency, maybe 20% of the population, and how in aggregate they have an effect on our disposition, our predisposition to becoming overweight or not. Contrast that to rare syndromic conditions, which we know about, where we have specific mutations in biological pathways which have a radical effect on our ability to perceive food, nutrition, to regulate appetite, and so on. So this is underpinning biological causality, which is then layered on top with social infrastructure and also other features which have an effect on presentation to disease or overweight and disease. Complications in this area too. This is a paper which was exciting. It's very simple. It takes a study called Biobank, which is a large-scale study in the UK. Simply asks the question, what's the causal relationship between adiposity and all-cause mortality? You'd think it's easy. And classically, you show these shapes, this curvy linear relationship. So if you're super lean, it's dangerous. And if you're overweight, it's dangerous. You try and model these things in a causal framework, as we did in this particular paper. And it's fraught with difficulty. These techniques often give the wrong answers and they can be biased. So this is really a slide about being cynical and challenging the evidence from an observational point of view, even when it looks obvious. Trials next, so interventions. We're lucky because they are done and they exist and they're efficacious. Here's a few. Direct trial of caloric restriction and lifestyle change, which has a radical impact on weight and also diabetes remission. Surgery, we know about it. In fact, this Biobank sleeve is a trial not looking at the efficacy of surgery, but contrasting different surgery types to work out which ones do better in different conditions for patients. And indeed, I've only chosen two here, but tirzepatide and semaglutide, as we know, are radically changing the landscape. They're feeding forward into policy, as you might expect. We've got NHS programs, we've got NICE guidelines coming forward. Indeed, NICE guidelines pushing these access routes through primary care, like radical changes as a result of trial-based information. Why is this line important? Well, it's important because the people who will be seen in primary care getting these drugs are totally different to those who are actually in the trials. And we don't know yet what is going to be the efficacy of those drugs in the real world. And as Naveed said, there's not just one or two, there are literally dozens coming through, of which some of them are in advanced stages and will be made available undoubtedly. So this notion of being able to combine regulatory apparatus in the body to be able to think about how to regulate appetite, I think is mega exciting. Is it a sledgehammer at the moment? And are there refined approaches to using these really powerful tools? I don't think so, but that will inevitably come. So it's an exciting time from the intervention point of view. Last up then, I was just going to say one more point about that because it excites me, is these aren't just trials of outcome. Do you get leaner or bigger or so on? But they're also looking at intermediate biology. So one of these studies, it's called STEP, it's to do with the intervention semaglutide, actually simultaneously harvesting biological samples and collecting, in this case, protein data. So the measures of how our cells are working underneath those values of clinical or clinical defined obesity or BMI, and challenging our fundamental understanding about the biology underneath those effects. Okay, the intersection I think is exciting, and this will lead me to a finish. We have these different ways of perturbing or changing or watching observationally variation in the risk of obesity or overweight. The question is, though, at the moment, if we're just measuring that or the outcome of that through crude assessments like BMI or waist-hip ratio and so on, are we really understanding the relative effects on disease risk or how people feel about those interventions, how genes work, how disease etiology downstream of that actually functions? I don't know, and I don't think we're there yet. I think there's a challenge for us at this point, this intersection, which is that currently we're trying to unify signals from interventions and the vast epidemiological catalogue suggesting that BMI is bad for us, simply with crude measures like kilograms per meter squared and so on. And actually, we don't know whether those things are connected. We don't know whether the interventions are going to solve the epidemiological challenges. So the challenge is, could we do better? And I don't know what the answer is here, but that's the intersection at the moment. I think that's very exciting for research going forward. So this is where we started, an overview landscape. I think actually, if you take right now, it's a super exciting moment for research into obesity, living with obesity, and measures of body composition. We can measure things pretty well. We've got very large-scale epidemiological studies happening. We've got effective interventions, which is just a radical concept for most of epidemiology. Clinical studies looking at whether they work or not in the real world. I think a receptive set of stakeholders who want to work with researchers, not just patients, but also industry, colleagues, and so on, and real voices in the room. Now, what better conditions for doing research in a really important area? So with that, I'll stop and happy to take questions later or throughout the day.